Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Maple Grove Scripture Reading Podcast. So I titled this episode, How to Suffer, and I realized that's not exactly a crowd-pleasing kind of title, because nobody's out there searching for a guide on that. But it might be the most useful thing that the book of Job has to teach us. There's a version of faith that looks like it's holding everything together. It's staying composed. It's trusting God in public. It's saying all the right things when people ask how you're doing. It's not letting the questions show too much, or the doubt, the anger, the grief. It's just keeping that calm surface. And for people who've been in churches their whole lives, that version of faith can feel like it's the only faithful option. You're supposed to trust God. You're supposed to have peace. You're not supposed to be undone. Well, Job is a 42-chapter argument against that version. Think about this. About 40% of the Psalms are laments. They're not praise songs. They're not confident declarations of victory. They're lament. They're honest, sometimes raw complaints addressed directly to God. And that proportion isn't an accident. The people who compiled the Psalter knew what human life actually looked like, and they left room for all of that. For example, Psalm 22 opens with, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish?" That's in the canon. It's scripture. Jesus quotes it from the cross. And it's not to prove a point. He's quoting it because it's true of what he's going through in that moment. He is lamenting. He's bringing his abandonment to his Father using words his people had been praying for generations. The God who received lament from Israel was receiving it from his own Son. If there were ever a reason to say the lament psalms don't apply to faithful people, the cross removes it entirely. Psalm 13 says, "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" Or Psalm 88. One of the darkest of the lament psalms. It ends without resolution. The final verse is, "Darkness is my closest friend." There's no turn to praise there. There's no closing declaration of trust. It's just darkness. And it's still in the Bible. That psalm was kept in the canon and sung in Israel's worship. Nobody edited it to end better or cut it because it failed to resolve. The people who assembled the Psalter understood that darkness is my closest friend spoken to God is still addressed to God. It's still prayer. These psalms aren't failures of faith. They're models of it. Genuine expressions of what it means to talk to God honestly. Lament isn't the opposite of faith. It's one of faith's most honest forms. Job takes us even further, though, than the Psalms do. Job laments through nearly the whole book. A psalm can be prayed in minutes, but Job's lament stretches across weeks and months of the story. It's not just a moment of honesty, it's a way of living. He starts in chapter 3 by cursing the day he was born. He wishes he had never existed. He describes his suffering in vivid and desperate language. He asks why he was not stillborn. He says the thing he feared most has come upon him. And he keeps going. Round after round of the debate with his friends, Job keeps crying out. He says hard things he later has got to take back. Lament isn't a license to say whatever comes to mind, but the book makes clear that God would rather have an honest, struggling prayer than silence. And the direction never changes. Job keeps his face turned toward God the whole time. He even says at one point, "I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me." So he accuses God of cruelty. He says his friends are merciless. In chapter 10, he says to God directly, "I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul. I say to God, do not declare me guilty, but tell me what charges you have against me." So he's not hiding his anger either. He's bringing it to God. These aren't things Job would say if he were writing a theology textbook. He says as much later. But they're honest expressions of how the suffering feels from inside the suffering. And God doesn't condemn him for making them. In fact, God ultimately commends Job over his friends. Because Job does something the friends never do. he stays in the relationship with the Lord. Even at his most anguished, most accusatory moments, he's still talking with God. And you can only speak to somebody that you believe is there. You can only complain to someone you think can hear you. The complaint itself is a form of faith. A man who truly believed that God was absent or didn't care wouldn't bother arguing with him. Anger at God isn't the same as unbelief. It can be evidence of the opposite. The person who's truly given up doesn't pray at all. But Job never gives up on prayer. He changes what he's asking for, but he never stops asking. Lament has a shape, and it's simpler than you might think. If you've been trained to bring only polished prayers to God, then lament feels wrong. Like you have to clean yourself up before you can speak, or like God's only interested in the version of you that has it all together. But Job's model is the opposite. He comes to God in pain, exactly as he is, and he doesn't apologize for it. The Psalms show you what this looks like. How long? Why do you hide? Those are complete prayers. They're not resolving. They bring the pain to the right address. And that's the thing that matters most in lament. It's who you're talking to. You're not just venting into the air. You're talking to someone. You're saying, God, I am in pain. I am waiting for you. That's what makes it prayer and not despair. Now, there's a specific kind of suffering that Job's story speaks to directly, the suffering that comes with the silence of God. For most of the book, God says nothing. Job cries out, the friends debate, Elihu speaks, God is silent. But then the whirlwind comes. But Job had no way of knowing that the whirlwind was coming. He just kept going, though. Psalm 10:1 puts it plainly, why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? That experience is so common that the Psalms name it repeatedly. The writers of the Psalms had been in that same silence that Job sits in. They named it because they lived it, and they keep bringing it to God. The sense that prayer is falling into nothing, that the silence means something is wrong. What Job's story shows is that the silence is not absence. The silence of God and the absence of God, they are not the same thing. Job can't feel the difference from the ash heap, but the book shows us both sides of the curtain. God's paying attention the whole time. The wager God makes in chapter 1 is a bet on Job, a confident declaration that Job's faith is real enough to survive. God hasn't stepped away from the story. He's in it from the first verse. But Job can't see that from where he sits. From the ash heap, it looks like silence. But at least he keeps talking anyway. He doesn't stop praying when God doesn't answer. He doesn't conclude that silence means that the line is dead. He keeps going, and he asks for more. And that's a model. Now, it's not a model of perfect theology or a tidy faith, but it's a model of staying in the conversation when every instinct might say that the conversation is over. Romans 8:26 says, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. The Spirit intercedes through wordless groans, which means the prayer that reaches God isn't always the prayer we managed to say. Sometimes it's just the ache. Paul is saying that the ache counts, that God receives what we can't put into words. Even our broken, insufficient prayer is held by someone who knows how to carry it. We don't have to have the right words or all the right theology. We just got to stay in the conversation. Job stayed. He cried. He argued. He pushed back. He said things that he had to take back, but he never stopped talking to God. And in the end, the whirlwind came. God's presence was real. And for Job, that ended up being enough. If you're in a season where God feels distant and prayer feels like talking into a void, then the book of Job is for you. And it's not because it's going to explain the silence, because as we've read it, you realize it doesn't. But it's because it shows a man who stayed in that silence came out the other side having seen God. The book doesn't promise that the whirlwind comes quickly or that it looks the way that you'd expect. Job's whirlwind arrived at the very end, but it did come. And the man who encountered God on the other side was the same man who'd been arguing with him from the ash heap because he kept talking. He refused to stop asking. The waiting is real, but the encounter is real too. Next time, we're going to finish up our podcast on Job, and we'll get to the last thing we want to say about it. We're going to look at what the book looks like from the other side of Easter and what it's pointing to that Job himself couldn't even see. Hope you have a great day, and we'll talk again soon. God bless.